Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Niharika, and I work in risk management. And over the years, I've held a variety of roles, which include fraud risk, payment risk, credit risk, and so on. So when I do data analysis for a hobby, I try to pick out data that's as different from work as possible. About 5 years ago, I injured my knee and I was bedridden and bored. So I bought myself a violin and I tried to teach myself music. I started out with classical music, but then I quickly gravitated to traditional music, specifically Irish. And because I found that it required a lot less discipline, and also they were a lot more forgiving when it comes to like misplaced notes. And I really like the Irish traditional music community because they have a great presence online. You have people from all over the world, not just Irish musicians, but everyone really who contributes to this site. And they have a great compilation of tunes. And for a beginner such as I don't know if you can tell, but I'm not Irish. So, so I did not grow up listening to Irish music. Irish music. I was well into my 20s the first time I heard an Irish tune even. So it was really useful for me, though traditional music is mostly transmitted by, it's oral. So people listen to somebody playing a tune and then they pick it up. But for a beginner like myself, it was really useful to see the sheet music laid out. And it's not clear, but there's probably over 20,000 Irish tunes in existence. And there's many versions of each tune too. So, and there's also different kinds of Irish tunes, some of which I've laid out on the slide, but the majority of them would fall into one of these two buckets, jigs and reels. For my analysis, I decided to stick to jigs because they have a very specific structure that is very unlike any of the other tunes. And because I wanted to analyze the patterns in these tunes, it would have worked if only I stuck to tunes with a similar structure. Jigs, they have a 6/8 time signature, which means there's 6 beats to a measure, which gives them a very catchy quality. If you remember the Irish party in third class from the film Titanic, those are great examples of jigs. Also, I used this Python-based package called Abjad to generate the music notation you see on screen. It's a great package. All you have to do is give it the settings and the notes, and it would give you back a PDF with the sheet music. So if you were to take apart an Irish jig, it would mainly compose of two parts, A and B. Most people play part A twice, followed by part B twice. But again, like all things traditional folk music, that's also subject to change. Sometimes there's a part C, but that's rarer. The smallest unit that you see is called a note, and the vertical lines are called bars, and everything between the bar is a measure. And that's all you need to know for this analysis. What does the data on the session.org itself look like? You have to remember that these submissions come from a lot of people who have their own quirks when it comes to submitting music. So it could look like something like this. This is a typical entry on the site. You have the version number, you have the name, some other information pertaining to the tune, and then the meat of the data is in the notes, which is that combination of letters and numbers that you see on the screen. These alphabets, they tell you where on your instrument your finger should go. And of course, the session also has sheet music and also MIDI, but I did not use those for my analysis. To give you an idea of what different versions of the same tune might look like, I put up a heat map of this very famous tune called Morrison's Jig. It's named for a very famous fiddler called Morrison. And he did not compose the tune, but he was famous for recording it. It was said that he heard the tune from a bandmate who himself heard it from his father. It kind of goes to show how the tunes travel from person to person before they end up being recorded. right? So you can see that the overarching structure of the tune remains the same. It's just that a few notes have shifted, a few levels. The areas of the more intense color are where the notes agree with each other, and where the notes are more diffuse, you see that people have a little more, they've taken a little more liberty with the notes. Right, so before I got to my analysis, I had to first standardize these user-submitted notes. And the challenge is compounded by the fact that my set of notes can be combinations of punctuation marks such as commas and apostrophes and letters. So I've put out, if you want to call it that, the universal set of my notes. You can see that they comprise the letters A to G, small and caps, and sometimes they can be combined with commas and apostrophes. So this made the data analysis a little difficult, but after a little Googling, I've found out about the package called RE, which is for regular expressions in Python, and I'm really glad that I did. Because the versatility that the RE package offers is kind of hard to overstate. And to me, it felt like the patterns that could be customized to almost a limitless extent. For people in the room that are not familiar with regex, I can give you a quick background. It stands for regular expressions. And to put it very simply, what happens is you give it a pattern, it could look for the pattern in the text, give you back your strings, and you could manage the strings, as simple as that. For example, if you look at the first example, say I want to look at a sequence of 3 notes in the range A to G, small R caps. All I have to do is provide it a pattern that looks like that. And it could match something like a DEF, but it wouldn't match an APC because because P isn't in the range. Similarly, if I add, in my next example, if I add the caret symbol, all that does is negate that. So anything that's not in the range A to G would match and not otherwise. Now, according to my third example, because my notes are a combination of letters and a comma or an apostrophe, I can provide that as well. So something like a capital B or a G comma or a C apostrophe would be a match, and anything else wouldn't. And now I can also use something like wildcard characters, where say I wanted to look for a sequence of notes that start with an A, end with a C, and have either no or any number of Bs in between. So it matches the patterns like AC, ABC, ABBC, and so on. And finally, if I wanted to look for a pattern ABC or EFG, I could just add the pipe symbol, which is the R. These are in no way the only things that regex can do, but these are what I used in my analysis, so this is what I'll talk about today. But I strongly urge you to look up what else are the possibilities in the package. Some of the functions that I found useful while using this were the escape function, which allows me to, if my pattern that has punctuation marks or something that's used in the regex package itself, it just allows me to escape it with a backslash. And that is important for me because my data has plenty of commas and apostrophes. The sub function looks for the pattern that I provide, which is the first argument, and substitutes it with the string in the second argument, which is an empty string in my case. And the third argument is just the input string. So what I've done is, as you can see, my input string has a bunch of spaces, and it has a carriage return, which I don't really need. So according to my pattern, I'm saying anything that's not in the range A to G, or doesn't have the comma or the apostrophe, which is, I guess what I'm saying is anything that doesn't look like a note, remove it. And I get back the cleaned up text. And while I was using this package, I found that some of my patterns were running pretty long. So the compile function is another useful function that I found. What you can do is load a pattern into a variable, and then you can use that variable wherever you can, anytime you want to call on that particular pattern. Find all, what that does is look for patterns in the input string and return to me my matches as a list of strings. Right? So for example, my input string is a bunch of notes, and say I want the component measures. So my pattern there signifies a measure, and all I have to say is find all, and it returns the list of measures to me. One thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the use of the question mark and the colon that you see there. I'll tell you why that's important. Because my measure is a series of 6 consecutive notes, that's the 6 that you see there in the curly braces, so that it's repetitive, right? And what happens when I don't have the question mark and the colon is that it returns to me whatever is matched between the parentheses. So you end up with what you can see in the second example, which is just the last notes of each measure. Since I want the measures themselves, I have to use what's called a non-capturing group. And that's when I end up with the component measures. So once I've done that and I have all my notes, all I need to do is transcribe them to numbers for ease of analysis. So one of the metrics I wanted to look at was the level by how much the notes shifted upward or downward. So once I have, so this is just plotting the basic structure, the average structure of an Irish tune through the years. It's very interesting to see how the structure hasn't changed through the years, and also how the high notes are hit in the second part of the tune. This is another example of a tune called My Darling Asleep. And I was looking at these tunes, and you kind of see that there's more variance in the notes towards the end of the tune. So the next question was, where do people vary the notes more during the course of a tune? And then that was easy to pull up by taking out the variance of the notes, the average variance across versions. And it turns out that people like to tinker the most with the tune towards the end of the tune. And so on. Once you have the numbers, it's easy to slice and dice the data anywhere you please. And what this graph shows you is the shifts in the note through the tune across the years. And the first heat map is from version 1 to 2, version 2 to 3, and version 3 to 4. The portions that are in red are the shifts downwards, so notes went from being high to low. And the versions in blue are where the notes went from being went to a higher position. I just think it's very interesting to see the pockets of activity, how the average levels of the tunes have shifted consistently. Sorry. Another metric that I wanted to look at was the number of times that a tune changed direction. So, say a note went from say an A to a C. That would count as an upward direction. Say the note stayed the same. That would be an S. And say the note went from a C to an A. That would be down, or I would denote it with a D. So any sequence of notes that I have, I can transform that to a series of directions that the tune took. And the change in direction can be found by looking at the number of times these patterns occur, which is a US star D, which means a UD or a USD or a USSD or so on. And similarly with a DS star U. So one of the other things that I found useful were look ahead. So for example, I was talking about counting the number of changes in direction. Say I start out with the string, and I want to count the number of changes in direction, and I'm looking for these patterns, right? The problem, if I don't use a look ahead, is that when I look for the pattern, that part of the string is consumed, and the next change in direction is looked for from that point forth, which I do not want, because my patterns can be overlapping. And I can fix that by using something called the look ahead, which is the question mark and the equal sign. So that non-overlapping patterns, overlapping patterns can be looked at. So if I didn't, so when I use it, I get the number of changes in direction as 3, which is the correct count. If I don't use it, you see that the number of changes in direction would only be 2. So when I plot out the number of changes in direction across the years, this is what I get. And I was disappointed with this graph because it doesn't tell me much. There's no trends that I can see. But I still included it to make a point that it was really easy to ask this question and get the answer with regex. Similarly, when is a look behind useful? It's the same thing as a look ahead, except it's in the opposite direction. If you remember, I was talking about the notes that, my set of notes that I have. And I don't know if you noticed, but not every letter combined with a comma or an apostrophe is a valid note. For example, a comma is only valid when it's preceded by a G or an A or a B. And similarly, an apostrophe is only valid when it's preceded by a C or a D. So if you wanted to be really careful about whether the notes you're picking up are valid or not, it's a great idea to use a look behind. For example, this pattern would match an a G comma, or a C apostrophe, but it does not match an A comma, which is not a valid note. And finally, this was something I found out really late because some of my patterns that I was writing were really long, and I couldn't understand what I had written as soon as 5 minutes after I'd written it. So it would be really useful to use something like a verbose, where you can it's simply the equivalent of commenting, where you can split your regex pattern into parts and explain it for your future self. I'd like to leave you with one last story. This was something that I was also looking at, which is the number of recordings was with the number of versions. Because the idea was that the more the number of recordings out there, the more the people have heard that tune and have their own versions of that tune, which they've submitted. And you can kind of see a correlation, which is kind of intuitive, I guess. And the color, it gives you the age of the tune in days. So you can also see that some of the paler tunes are at the lower number of recordings and have a lower number of versions, which also is kind of intuitive, I guess, because they haven't been out there for long enough to have recordings on them or to have people come up with different versions of them. But the first time that I mapped this, it looked like this. And I don't know if you can see, the culprit is in the bottom right corner, which is a tune called Gun Aim, which has over 200 versions and no recordings. And I had listened to my fair share of Irish music, and I had never heard of this tune. But when I Googled it a little, it just came out that Gun Aim means no name in Irish. So anybody that was submitting a tune that they didn't know the name of, they would just tag it as no name. And it goes to show why surprising results must be investigated, because there's sometimes a good story there. These were the resources that I used while doing this analysis, and I'd specifically like to call out number 5, which is a great resource for all things music related in Python packages. And I don't know if I was able to convey it, but regex was a really versatile package, and pretty much any harebrained pattern that I came up with, I was able to execute it using regex. And if you ever have to deal with text-based data, and you haven't used regex, I would strongly urge you to look into it. Thank you.